Friday, the day that he died. The upper room, 8 o'clock p.m. Once the clock struck 8, Jesus entered into his final day. Once the meal was finished, he stood up from the head of the table and he disrobed, and he took on the role of the servant priest. While he was most certainly their Lord and their master, he knelt down to wash his disciples' feet as a common slave, a role usually reserved for the very lowliest servant in the home. That was the point. Jesus was modeling for his disciples the kind of life that he was calling them to live, and the kind of life that they would be called to live as well. No longer would they be focused upon themselves or worried about their statuses, but humbly focused on the needs of others, John 13:12-30. When Jesus rose from this shocking display, and it was shocking, of servant leadership and love, he sat back down at the table, and he took the bread and the wine, and he distributed it to his disciples. This is called the Lord's Supper, and it happened on Good Friday. Now, it's far more than just an after-dinner snack. We talk about this every week in church. Jesus was demonstrating how that he was going to serve them best, and it was going to be by dying on their behalf. Just as he had knelt down to clean them with rags, his body would be broken for their purification. And he would cleanse not only their dirty feet with water, but his blood would cleanse their dirty soul. Jesus was showing them a foretaste of the gospel and of the kingdom just moments before he would be called to live it out in real time. The irony is that the disciples did not get it, not at all. In fact, while Jesus was demonstrating this radical act of humility and sacrificial love and service, an argument broke out among his followers on who was the greatest. Luke 22:24-27. They were still jostling to be first in the kingdom when Jesus had just modeled that the first should be last. Luke 22:24-30. One can scarcely imagine the heaviness of heart that Jesus must have felt in this moment. His disciples were bickering and missing the overarching point. One of his nearest and dearest followers had left and was soon going to betray him. One was soon going to deny him 3 times, which was Peter. John 13:36-38. The other disciples were very soon going to abandon him and scatter. Mark 14:50. And his friend, his fellow disciple, Judas, was moments away from handing him over to be killed. John 13:21-26. Seconds later, after the events that we just described, Satan entered into the heart of Judas, and he left. He walked out of the room in order to carry out his murderous plot. The disciples still had no clue what was actually happening, John 13:28-29. Instead of becoming bitter with what was going on around him, Jesus took these final moments of freedom, his last hour in the upper room, in order to instruct his followers and to prepare them for his death. You can read these words of comfort in the following passages. As you read them, try to imagine what it would have been like to be in the room with Jesus. He's about to be arrested. He's about to be killed. And everything he says in these passages are spoken against that bloody backdrop. The passages that you can read on your own for personal study are these. John 14:1-6, where Jesus comforts his disciples. Or when he prepares his disciples for what's ahead, John 14:7-16:33. We call this the upper room discourse. You can also read how Jesus prays for his disciples in John 17. It's a very intimate prayer. It's the only recorded prayer of Jesus that we have in the Bible. You can read about how Jesus sings with his disciples in the upper room before he leaves, Mark 14:26. And you can read how Jesus departs with his disciples in verse 27 of that same chapter. All of these events that we just covered happen between the hours of 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. The arrest. After an hour-long discourse with his followers, Jesus and his disciples left the city. They crossed the well-known Kidron Valley, the same valley David crossed when he was being betrayed by his own son. And they headed back towards the Mount of Olives, where they stopped at one of Jesus' favorite places, a garden called Gethsemane, John 18:1. Judas knew it well, since Jesus often met with his disciples there, John 18:2. So it's not surprising that he and the angry mob that he rustled together from the Pharisees would find Jesus there and find him easily. Jesus wasn't hiding, as we said before. Jesus wasn't afraid to die. And he awaited the arrival of this unholy brute squad with holy anticipation. He went off by himself while he waited to pray, Luke 22:39-41. He left the larger group of disciples to sleep, while appointing Peter, James, and John to pray and to keep watch by night, Mark 14:33-34. While he went a stone's throw distance ahead of them, it's likely in this moment that the three men were finally overtaken by the gravity of this moment and they collapsed in sleep. Perhaps they heard Jesus' grief as he cried out in tearful agony, Luke 22:44. Perhaps after thinking about who might betray Jesus, they became emotionally exhausted and they fell asleep. Whatever the reason, the text tells us that they collapsed into slumber from their sorrow, Luke 22:45. After an hour of weeping and agony to God in prayer, Jesus resigned himself to the will of God. He stood knowing that what was about to happen, and he gave himself fully to the task ahead. He went back one final time to awake his sleeping followers, which was right about the time Judas and the Roman cohort arrived, John 18:3-4. Judas greeted Jesus with a friendly kiss so that the Roman mob would know exactly who to arrest. While Jesus was well known in the region, he wasn't well known to the Romans. Apart from his most intimate betrayal by Judas, they had no idea who he was. The moment Judas kissing Jesus in absolute tyranny hung in the air as if time stood still. On one side were the Roman guards, who were likely assessing the size of Jesus' group and mulling over strategy in case the 12 men decided to rebel. On the other side, the bewildered disciples, rubbing the sleep out of their eyes, began wondering what was about to actually take place. The moment apparently was too much for the Apostle Peter, sensing his Lord was about to be taken captive right before his eyes. In an instant, he leapt into action, swinging the sword that he was carrying at the very first person that he met, which unfortunately just so happened to be a man named Malchus, a slave of the high priest, whose ear got chopped off in the endeavor, John 18:10. If Jesus had not immediately quelled the intensity of Peter and healed the young man's ear, a bloodbath would have actually ensued. The Romans would have leapt into action, and they would have killed every one of Jesus' disciples before the kingdom even got off the ground. So Jesus, in his wisdom, slows the situation down to a manageable level. And while Jesus doesn't condemn the marauding party for their arresting him publicly, he does submit to the arrest. He was bound, and he was carried out of the sight of his disciples, Luke 22:54. This takes us to around 11 p.m. on the night that Jesus died. He was delivered over to the house of Annas first, the former high priest that John tells us about in John 18:12-14, before being taken to his son-in-law, the current high priest, who is Caiaphas, Luke 22:66-71. Caiaphas himself had assembled the council of elders against him, and Peter, along with the unnamed disciple, followed behind them. This takes us to around 12 o'clock a.m., midnight, when the trial ensues. Now, during those proceedings, false and inconsistent witnesses, charges were being leveled at Jesus that were clearly fallacious, Mark 14:55-59. And since a case in the Jewish law that the Pharisees had disregarded time and time again, but nonetheless could not be substantiated except on the basis of two agreeing witnesses. This sham trial sputtered on without finding a single shred of incriminating evidence or two people that could agree on anything, Matthew 26:59-60. At some point, they got their heads and their stories together. Two witnesses stood up with a consistent account. They quoted Jesus' words from John 2 concerning the temple, that he would destroy it, and in 3 days he would raise it back up again, Mark 14:57-58. This accusation angered everyone in the room. Remember, the temple was the pride and joy of the Jewish people. It was the crown jewel of their little empire. And they not only completely misunderstood what Jesus was saying in that passage, but they had grown to love this building, in fact, more than they even loved their God, who the building was dedicated to in the first place. Upon hearing this witness, Caiaphas himself interrogated Jesus, who at first remained silent before his shearers, Matthew 26:63. But eventually he gave the wicked priest the ammunition that he needed to pull the trigger, Luke 22:66-71. The charge was blasphemy against God, and there would be no escape for Jesus, who just said, "You will see me coming on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas tore his robes, and the whole ordeal was now put into motion. Outside the chamber, Peter had followed along to investigate what was going on and was inconspicuously warming himself by the fire. But while trying to keep his identity a secret, two servant girls and a bystander recognized him. I guess that's what he gets for chopping off the high priest servant's ear. And they culminated in questioning him. They said, "You were there, weren't you?" All of this precipitated his threefold denial of Christ, Matthew 26:69-74. Just as Jesus had prophesied, the rooster crowed after the third denial. Jesus and Peter made eye contact, Luke 22:61, and then Peter ran away bitterly weeping in sorrow, Luke 22:62. Jesus was now fully alone with his accusers, the ones who mocked him and beat him periodically all through the night until the morning, Luke 22:63-65. On one occasion, sometime between midnight and the morning dawn, one of them spat right in his face and mocked him in the most shameful way, Matthew 26:67. When the morning came, when the sun was about to break over the horizon, they bound him and they led him to Pilate for final sentencing, Matthew 27:1. 4:00 a.m. Now, around the same time that Jesus was being prepared for transport and he was being taken to be sentenced by Pilate, Judas, the betrayer, was in deep remorse for what he had done. It is likely that he watched the entire trial and now, seeing Jesus condemned, wanted to undo what he had put in motion. Matthew 27:3-4. The Jewish leaders, of course, refused to take the money or release Jesus back to him, which prompted Judas to fling the money at them and to go outside the city and hang himself in grief. It truly would have been better, Jesus said, if that man had never been born. Matthew 26:24. The sentencing, 5:00 a.m., with no sleep. Being awake for nearly 24 hours, Jesus was preparing himself to stand trial in front of the Roman Pilate, who wanted nothing to do with this entire fiasco, John 18:28-31. The city had already swollen to 10 times its population, and keeping the rebellious Jews under control and without rebellion was Pilate's chief occupation. Condemning one Jewish insurrectionist to pacify the raucous crowd may have been politically dangerous if things got out of hand, although the Jews did Pilate the favor of secretly condemning Jesus away from the crowds who loved him and by bringing him early in the morning for sentencing before the city awoke. Had they not done this, Pilate may have lost control of the city, which would have almost certainly lost him his career and maybe even his life. He was walking on eggshells, as it were, and he was hoping to quell the mobs. In fact, on several occasions, the Roman governor attempted to dismiss the charges brought against Jesus by interviewing him individually in his own private quarters, John 18:33-38. Pilate interceded for him before the crowds, John 18:38-40, and he offered to the crowds to release Jesus instead of Barabbas, a known insurrectionist, Mark 15:9. When that did not work, he pawned Jesus off as the Jewish king, and Herod was to do with him as he willed, Luke 23:6-10. In the end, Pilate's attempts were futile. The crowds did not calm. Herod would not exonerate him, and soon Jesus was standing in front of Pilate once more, with the Jews screaming in the city streets, "Crucify him, crucify him." And they were saying, "You are no friend of Caesar if you allow this man to live," John 19:2. Pilate knew that the Jewish people could end his career if the rumor got out that he was no friend of Caesar. Caesar does not accept sedition. So Pilate adopted a modified approach, still attempting to rescue Jesus, but doing enough damage as to even the judicial balances. He flogged Jesus. He whipped him with 40 lashes with the cat of nine tails, determined to punish Jesus, but then release him. This occurred around 9 a.m. on the morning of Jesus' death. Now, scourging was a punishment, a vicious sort of punishment that Pilate ordered the Roman lectors to inflict upon Christ. John 19:1. This was 40 lashes with a diabolical whip, sometimes referred as the cat of nine tails, which would rip through human flesh and muscle and tendons, exposing vital organs and bones, and leaving the victim nearing circulatory shock. If this were not brutal enough, the Roman guards mocked Jesus, pressing razor-like thorns in the shape of a crown down upon his skull. They robed him in royal purple robes, giving him a mock scepter, and bowed jeeringly to ridicule him and abuse him even more. John 19:2-3. It's likely while Jesus was being beaten that Pilate's wife finally managed to send a message to him about her dream that she had the night before. She told him that she was deeply troubled concerning Jesus. She warned her husband not to have anything to do with this man and not to condemn him because he was innocent. Matthew 27:19. Pilate would likely be hoping that the Jewish people would look at the beaten and bloodied wretch and would relent of their murderous plot, but it didn't work. Seems as if Pilate underestimated the Jewish level of hatred for Jesus, since this did nothing whatsoever to quell the crowd's maniacal anger. John 19:5-7. They yelled all the more, "Crucify him, crucify him," and they began rioting right in front of him in order to force Pilate's hand. Matthew 27:23-24. In a moment of desperation, Pilate himself caved, seeing no way that the Jews were going to relent of their fury. And with his job, and with his life, and with his career at stake, Jesus was just not significant enough for him to save him. It was at this point that Pilate rose up, ceremoniously washing his hands, symbolically assuaging himself of any perceived guilt that anyone could claim that he had. And it was at that time that the Jewish crowds were given their bloodthirsty lust to do with Jesus whatever they wanted. And they said all too eagerly that they would receive his guilt upon their own heads. Matthew 27:25. A guilt that would be executed in the years ahead. Around 11 a.m., the crucifixion proper began. 14 hours earlier, Jesus was in the upper room singing and praying, reclining and worshiping with his friends. 14 hours later, he was physically unrecognizable to them. Once Pilate turned him over to be crucified, the heavy crossbeam was laid upon his exposed shoulders. John 19:17. Every unsanded splinter from this rough-cut board pierced the exposed meat and the nerve endings that screamed in agony on Jesus' back. He was barely able to stand, so weakened by the scourging that he collapsed in the streets. At this point, a man from the crowd was chosen, Simon of Cyrene, which Luke 23:26 tells us about. He was chosen to carry the crossbeam of Jesus, who could no longer bear the weight of it himself. The execution site, Calvary, was also known as the place of the skull, Matthew 27:33, and it was Simon who carried the beam to the top of the hill. It was a hilltop advertisement to the power and the might of Rome. It was propaganda to all of the would-be insurrectionists that there's futility in your uprising. Once Jesus staggered to the top of the hill, his wrists and his feet were pierced with nails the size of railroad spikes, and he was hoisted up and dropped down into the hole where he was affixed on the main beam of the cross. Now, according to ancient traditions and ancient prophecies, he was placed between two criminals, Isaiah 53:12, while the soldiers divided up his possessions, Psalm 22:18. Above his head, Pilate placed the mocking propaganda, Jesus, the Nazarene, the King of the Jews, written in 3 different languages so that everyone who traveled to Jerusalem on that day could read it and take notice. This is what Rome will do to you if you rebel against us. The obvious meaning could not have come through with more lucidity. Jesus looked down to see his mother staring up at him in horror. Jesus loved her. Now hanging on the cross, he would love her one final time, charging the Apostle John, his beloved disciple, to look after her while he was gone. Inside, his mother's heart was breaking. Before death completely overtook him, he had to endure the voluminous taunts and sneers and mockings that entered his well-preserved ears. People on the ground jeered at him, and one after the other, the men who were crucified beside him taunted him. But one man, one of those crucified wretches, finally saw him for who he was. This was heaven's first citizen, a forgiven thief that Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus, knowing everything now had been accomplished, he asked for a drink, again to fulfill the prophecies of Psalm 22:15. Once he tasted the bitter, sour wine, he uttered those famous words, "It is finished," signifying that forgiveness was now accomplished forevermore. John 19:30. It would not be long for now that he would give up his spirit and he would die. 12 o'clock p.m., noon, as Jesus faded in and out of consciousness. Being awake now for roughly 36 hours, darkness fell upon the earth for about 3 full hours on that day. Luke 23:44. Around 3 o'clock p.m., after suffering in agony for hours on the cross, during the 3rd hour of the darkness that had descended upon the land, and after hanging on the cross for more than 5 hours at this point, Jesus gave up his spirit and he breathed his final breath. Luke 23:46-47. The great teacher and rabbi spoke his final words as a quotation of Psalm 22, reminding everyone watching that they had not only perfectly killed him, but they had perfectly fulfilled the prophecy of David concerning him. By uttering these words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus was reminding them that Psalm 22 had now come true. And in that moment, he breathed his final breath. Now around 4 p.m. that day, when Jesus breathed his last breath on that rugged cross, several cataclysmic events happened almost immediately. First, there was an earthquake that broke out upon the land, Matthew 27:51. So bad, in fact, that it caused the Roman guard below Jesus to admit that he really must have been the Son of God. This might have been heaven's second convert. The temple veil that guarded the way into the holy place was also ripped from the very top of it to the bottom. In Luke 23:45, Jesus hanging on the cross had such an impact on creation that the curtain inside the temple tore in two. This signified that God would no longer dwell in a temple made with human hands, but on the basis of Jesus Christ's sacrifice, his finished work, God was now going to dwell in the hearts of the forgiven and the redeemed. Humans would now become the Holy of Holies, where God dwells. Finally, Matthew tells us that even the graves of the Old Testament saints were opened, and many of them came out and walked around and appeared to many in the city. Matthew 27:52. Now around 7 o'clock p.m., just before sunset, remember the Jewish day begins at 8 o'clock. Jesus' death had triggered the end of the old world order. And now, dawning was a brand new age, a new testament, a new covenant. Now, this would be especially apparent on Sunday morning when the tomb was found empty, but until then, the religious leaders ordered that his body would be taken down as quickly as possible so as not to defile their Passover celebration, John 19:31-37. For the time, his body would be placed in a borrowed grave, John 19:38-42. Friday was coming to a close at 8 p.m. It began at the dinner table in the upper room and it ended in a borrowed tomb. This concludes the events of Good Friday. And tomorrow, join us as we look at what happened on Holy Saturday as Jesus' body lay in the grave awaiting resurrection. Until then, God bless you.